Hello and welcome to the MJ Rose Show. Now, for the past 10 years it seems that there's been constant 80s revivals. So for instance in 2009 we had LaRue and Little Boots. In 2014 we had Years and Years, 2015 the 1975 and The Weeknd and Bruno Mars. It seems like the 80s have constantly been rearing their heads over and over again. Unfortunately this didn't last, which is annoying because the bands were actually really good and end up falling into the fad category like, oh, remember when we thought the 80s were going to come back? But alas, we haven't lost hope of the glorious decade returning. Here in 2016, well 2017 now, but we had a new glorious 80s revival contender. It was of course, Blossoms. This is clear from the get-go with the highly synth-tinged lead single, Charlemagne, and the perfect balance of the synthesizers and the indie guitars on tracks like Texia give them a feel almost identical to that of New Order. Critics have decided to call Blossoms the brand new Stone Roses, probably owing to them coming from Manchester, because in my personal opinion, they don't actually have that much in common with the Stone Roses, because whereas Blossoms are more 80s emphasised, going heavy on the synthesizers and the rhythms, the Stone Roses are more influenced by the incoming dance music from the 90s, incorporating those funky rhythms into the typical indie setup for their tracks. And also, the Stone Roses aren't just critically acclaimed for their musicianship, also for how influential they've been on major music. They created a new, unique sound that's become a staple of British music. It's a sort of vibe you get from an Oasis track, all the Britpop from the 90s, all the post-Britpop in the early 2000s. Essentially, every band is like the Stone Roses because they're all following that same unique sound, and Blossoms fall into this. But as they're from Manchester, yeah, you get where the critics are coming from with that. And that also probably owes to the fact that the album was produced by Something Skelly, who was a member of the Coral, a band heavily influenced by the psychedelia of the Stone Roses. But like the Stone Roses, they're a very likeable band, have a very band of the people sort of feel, and this really comes through in their backstory, because when you hear that they met at Alton Towers, were playing at restaurants, cafes at first, and then they were practicing in one of their members' grandfather's steel mill, which in fact appears on the cover of the album. You just get the real good sense that these are just a group of young lads with a strong, true love for music, and that's why they have a sort of similar young, fresh appeal that Catfish and the Bottlemen had, because they also had a very inspirational young musicians make it big backstory. But as for the album itself, it is brilliant. As I say, on tracks like Charlemagne, it has a heavy influence of the 80s, but overall I'd say it reflects all the recent types of indie in modern years. For instance, you also get a bit of 90s Britpop ballad on tracks like My Favourite Room, again cementing their band of the people-like status, and also of the early 2000s with the vocal delivery and lyrics on the track Cut Me I'll Bleed being very reminiscent of the Arctic Monkeys. So it's really hard not to see the appeal of this album because it is total fun. Every track is dead catchy and you just want to listen to it over and over again. It is essentially what modern pop music should be, catchy, fun, enjoyable, but also not feel totally manufactured, have a young, fresh, essentially human face to it that pop music just seems to be missing out on nowadays. However, if there is one flaw to the album, is that all the tracks do essentially feel like singles. This is probably because it is just a collection of tracks taken from their first few EPs and then mixed together in a sort of way, so it is essentially, does have a very compilation greatest hits type feel, even though it is a debut album. So despite most of the tracks each being really good, if you tried to listen to it as an album as a whole, it would sort of feel like a elongated, dragged-on experience because of how similar they all sound. At times it's hard to tell which is which, like I was struggling to remember the names of each track compared to how each one sounded. They all sound so similar. They do sort of mix things up with the slow, highly distorted ballad Onto Her Bed, but that track doesn't last long and doesn't really go anywhere, so it feels more like a distorted interlude between tracks, like what Alt J did on their debut. But on the whole, this album is great. It never ceases to be catchy and fun, particularly on tracks like Charlemagne and Cut Me and I'll Bleed, and it will appeal to indie fans of all ages, whether it be the New Order fans of the 80s, Oasis fans of the 90s, the Kasabian and Arctic Monkeys fans of the 2000s, and even the fans of Bombay Bicycle Club here in the 2010s. Unlike other pop bands nowadays, they maintain a distinct personality and even a distinct Britishness on the track Blown Rose, where they mention The stately homes of England. I mean, just a brilliantly quirky lyric, just like the sort you get from Vampire Weekend. So on the whole, I'd say the best, catchiest tracks would definitely be Charlemagne, Cut Me and I'll Bleed and Blown Rose, and I also love My Favourite Room because it's just sort of really chill, band of the people, feel good it gives you. And the worst tracks, definitely Onto Her Bed, because I said it just acts as an interlude that doesn't really go anywhere, and also Smashed Pianos, because it isn't really doing anything different from the rest of the album, and it just isn't as catchy as any of the others. I give this album a solid 7.5. So if you're a big fan of the 80s, I'd highly recommend the acts like New Order if you really like Blossoms. If you really like the modern take on the 80s, I'd highly recommend the 1975 because they're just brilliant, really diverse and fun. If you like dead catchy indie, I'd recommend Two Door Cinema Club. And if you like the really pubby, British, sing-along but also electronic tinged indie, then I'd recommend the likes of Kasabian. That's all for now. Sayonara.